Well, a Matthew Tkachuk trade has happened, and the star winger is not going to Smashville. Yeah, the Predators reportedly weren't on the list of teams Tkachuk wanted to go to, but there's still a story within a story there. Are the Predators done making moves, or is there still one big swing left in David Poile's tank? We'll talk about that, plus what the forward core might look like next year for the Nashville Predators. We'll talk about today on the Locked On Predators podcast.
You're Locked On Predators, your daily podcast on the Nashville Predators. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked On Predators your first listen of the day every single day. I'm Nick Morgan. I'm a writer and editor at ontheforecheck.com. Normally, I have a partner in crime, but Ann is taking a little vacation, well-deserved vacation. So she will be back shortly. Also want to mention today's show brought to you by our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. So the big story around the NHL this week, Matthew Tkachuk going to the Florida Panthers, not the Nashville Predators. When I first heard about this trade, when somebody first told me like what the trade was and who it was for, which was Jonathan Huberdeau, Mackenzie Weegar, and a first round pick, my instant reaction, the first reaction I had was, this kind of seems like an overpay, doesn't it? Like it seems like, the Panthers obviously got Tkachuk, which is great, but it seems like they're also losing a lot in the process. Now, I get why they did it. And, a lot of people have kind of pointed things out, like both Huberdeau and Weegar were set to be unrestricted free agents at the end of this year, and there is some doubt that they were going to be able to sign both of them. Two, obviously, Tkachuk is much younger than Jonathan Huberdeau, so you're all of a sudden you kind of get a longer window for the core team you have right now. And you have Tkachuk locked up for 8 years. So you really don't have to worry about needing to negotiate or worrying about cap space. You kind of had your core set. I get that. But it just seems kind of weird, doesn't it? That the Florida Panthers would trade somebody who arguably was the best player on their team last year. Not only that, but maybe the second best defender on their team besides Aaron Ekblad in Mackenzie Weegar, a very good defenseman. And that's the thing is a lot of people are like, oh, well, you're going to have to give up a lot to get Tkachuk, but let's not overlook the fact that Huberdeau was an MVP candidate for most of last season. I mean, the dude had 115 points, led the NHL in assist, more assists than, Connor McDavid, who normally just excels in that category. So it's interesting to say the least. Now, if you're the Florida Panthers, you have your core locked up. You have Tkachuk coming in. Him together with Alexander Barkov is going to be fantastic to watch next year. My question is, does it make the Florida Panthers better? And that's kind of the $1 million question is, does it make them better? Because it kind of depends on what you think of Tkachuk versus Huberdeau. Like Tkachuk is younger. He's definitely got more upside. He's entering his prime. But, for the next season at least, you're losing a guy that was the best player in your team last year. You're losing your second best defenseman, and you give up a first round pick. I mean, that's a lot to lose to bring in one guy. And again, if it's worth it, if you think Tkachuk is that missing piece that you can build around, then that's fine. But it just seems like the Panthers now have a bunch of holes they need to fix to get back to where they were last season. If somebody had talked about this trade and went, okay, it was Huberdeau and Weegar for Tkachuk straight up, that would have made a little bit more sense, because it's two expiring contracts, but two really good players. And, you're bringing back, a guy that's kind of on that same level as Huberdeau, just a little bit younger, maybe a little bit more upside, and you can lock him up long term. Like maybe Weegar was that missing piece to make that trade happen, not, missing piece to Calgary's cup chances or anything like that. Um, that would have maybe made a little bit more sense to me. But, hey, I've said it before on this podcast when talking about the Predators. If there's a guy you want, if there's a guy you're dead set on thinking is like the best option for your team moving forward, why not take a swing? I mean, we've seen that like in all sports here recently, like the Los Angeles Rams, who won the Super Bowl after basically mortgaging their next 3, 4 drafts to bring in all these star players. You've seen the Florida Panthers do it obviously this year. I mean, Colorado kind of sold out a little bit to get some good players on their team. Tampa Bay Lightning in the NHL notorious for kind of doing that, for just giving away first round picks like they're candy. So, if you're the Florida Panthers in Tkachuk's your missing piece, fine, whatever. If you can justify it, that's good. On the other side, if you're the Calgary Flames, whew, does this trade change the perspective on your team for next season? No team, I think, in a span of a few hours has gone from, an absolutely abysmal bottom of the division pick to back kind of where they were last year in a fashion as quickly as the Flames did. Because not only, you obviously lost both Gaudreau and Tkachuk, but you're bringing back Jonathan Huberdeau, who, like I said earlier, was an MVP candidate for much of the season, was in that conversation even up until the awards came in. Like, he was one of the best players in the league last year. You get a 115-point player to put back on that top line, which included Elias Lindholm, who had 40 goals last year, and Tyler Toffoli, who exploded when he went from Montreal to Calgary in that trade. Like, he definitely came in and proved like, oh, he is going to be a piece for the Calgary Flames for a long time. And you're also adding Mackenzie Weegar, who, again, the Flames on their defensive core this year lost Eric Gudbranson, and that's it. So basically, you replaced Eric Gudbranson with Mackenzie Weegar, who, again, was one of the best defenders last year for the Florida Panthers, like very underrated defenseman. And you have some really good two-way defensemen on Calgary, like Dougie Hamilton, Rasmus Anderson, that you can that you can now kind of get creative with Mackenzie Weegar, maybe shift some lines around and give that defense more depth, because that was kind of the one knock on Calgary last year, is they had some good defensemen that didn't have a lot of depth. And, they forced Markstrom to kind of have to do a lot, especially in the postseason. So that really shifts kind of the narrative for Calgary now. They have to re-sign both players. Who knows if Huberdeau wants to stay in Western Canada? Who knows if Weegar wants to stay in Western Canada? I mean, this could very well be like a 1-year thing, see how it goes. And then all of a sudden, both of them are back on the unrestricted free agency market next year. But hey, if Calgary thinks their window is now and they have the players to do it, then this certainly keeps them in the playoff hunt. Like, I mean, this certainly, I think, would keep them kind of where they were at the end of last season, which is phenomenal when you think of who they lost this offseason. Like, I think that's pretty good for Calgary. So, interesting trade. We'll see how it works out. Now, obviously, there's a Preds perspective there. Obviously, a lot of fans wanted Tkachuk to come to Music City. Turns out Tkachuk didn't really feel the same way. He was not on board with the Nashville Predators. So we'll talk about that, the implications for the Preds, and if there's still a big fish out there. But first, want to mention today's show brought to you by our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your betting needs. You can find all of your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. You can find reviews and news of every single league: Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, MLS, WNBA, combat sports, esports, even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all of your sports wagering information as well, from live in-game betting, scores, podcasts, props, odds, and lines. They have you covered. So head to betonline.net today. Use your phone or mobile device to learn more about the trends in action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. So obviously, Nashville Predators fans wanted Matthew Tkachuk in Music City, which, it's Matthew Tkachuk, so who can blame them? There were reports out there that there was like a note or like a trade list floating around of teams Tkachuk would want to go to. Nashville was on one of them. There's later reports disputing that list. We just didn't know what about it was being disputed. And it turns out, yeah, Nashville was never on Matthew Tkachuk's radar. David Poile was at Tennessee Sports Hall of Fame over the weekend. Jill Jelnick from Fox Nashville talked to him. She asked him about Matthew Tkachuk. And he said that, yeah, they did call Calgary. They wanted to ask on Matthew Tkachuk. Poile kind of snuck in there that pretty much everybody in the NHL wanted to talk to him. And he was told that Tkachuk did not have Nashville on the list of teams he wanted to go to. He said there's only, I think he said like 3 or 4 teams that he gave Calgary. These were obviously Calgary could have traded them anywhere he want, but these were teams that Tkachuk would have been willing to sign a long-term deal with. And yeah, I'm guessing that there's probably a lot of teams that weren't going to trade for Matthew Tkachuk unless they got that comfort of knowing he was going to be locked up for 7-8 years, whatever that wound up being. So interesting. It's kind of a buzzkill, obviously. Be interesting to know what the other teams on that list were. Apparently St. Louis was one just because of, his dad, Keith Tkachuk, being there for several years and being a big part of the Blues alumni and whatnot. So you have to imagine that's one. Not sure who the other couple would have been. Maybe Ottawa for a reunion with Brady, which that would have been prime entertainment for the next handful of seasons. It's interesting. I mean, it's interesting that also you wouldn't want to come to Nashville because, there at least are pieces there. You got Roman Josi, you got UC Saros, Philip Forsberg just re-signed for 8 years. Matt Duchene still locked up for quite a while. So there definitely would have been a fit for Tkachuk. Interesting that he would go there. It's interesting to read into David Poile's comments about at least him calling on Tkachuk. Now, there's a couple different ways you can look at it. You can look at it as Poile doing his due diligence, which, you should as a GM, and just going out and seeing what's out there. If there is a big name player like Tkachuk up for trade, you should do your due diligence to go in, look at that, and see if there is a trade that you can make to bring him in for your team. Like that totally makes perfect sense. Yeah. The other way you can look at it is that maybe David Poile's not done trying to make another big swing, that he's maybe not as content with this roster right now as it would seem. I mean, sure, like, if you flame out in the first round for the last handful of seasons, of course you're not necessarily going to be content with the roster. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people saw the Nino Niederreiter signing last week and were like, oh yeah, the Preds they're done. This is the team they're going to be rolling out with next week. So, for the Preds that they made that trade but are still calling on Tkachuk, kind of makes you wonder. It's like, okay, maybe there's something else out there for the Nashville Predators. Now, the big question would obviously be who, because Tkachuk's off the table now. Patrick Laine's off the table now. The really only pieces out there that are considered, I guess, the big fish would be JT Miller, who has 1 year left on his contract, and he presumably could be going to unrestricted free agency market at the end of this next season. So the Preds would probably prefer to do something like they did or like they would have done with Tkachuk, which is try to lock him up long-term before they trade. So they know they're not mortgaging an arm and a leg to get him. The other interesting name out there is Vladimir Tarasenko, who you would have to clear a lot of cap space for, but apparently St. Louis is dead set on moving him for cap reasons. They want to get a little bit younger, maybe build the team around Robert Thomas and Jordan Kyrou. So that's a name that's out there as well. Obviously, Tarasenko's still a pretty good player, had 80 points last season, so he can still score. Very injury prone, which I think maybe would scare the Nashville Predators out of it a little bit. But yeah, I mean, even if it's kind of a more low-key player too, you look at a team like Toronto, who has some cap issues and reportedly maybe trying to move Alexander Kerfoot, who that would be an interesting addition to like the middle six of the Predators lineup. So it's interesting that the Predators are still maybe kicking the tires on some guys out there. Obviously, cap space is going to kind of be the biggest concern for the Nashville Predators at this point. Cap Friendly has them at more or less right around $4 million. It's probably a little bit on either side of that $4 million mark. Cap Friendly right now has them over, but there's also some players on the roster they have listed on the NHL roster that are definitely going to be in the minors. And there's definitely some people they have listed in the minors that are definitely going to be on the NHL roster. So kind of a little bit of a mismatch there, but yeah, a couple of that is going to have to go to Yakov Trenin just because he still needs a new contract. And I would imagine that's probably going to get resolved in about the $2 million range. I don't know if it's enough to go out there and take a swing at somebody like Phil Kessel and bring him in, although I still think he'd be a perfect addition. The Predators would probably be needing to part with somebody else on the roster to make that happen. With Ryan McDonagh coming in, like maybe they're still content on looking for a trade for Dante Fabro. Who knows? But it does seem that, the fact that Poile is at least kind of taking calls and he hasn't said he's done, makes me think that there may still be something out there for the Nashville Predators. Now, as Ann and I said last week, if that doesn't happen and they go into the year with this roster, I would say that's fine. Like, I'd say you address some key needs. You replace Nick Cousins with Zach Sanford, who I think that's a pretty fine substitution. The biggest hole you had was on your second line, and you upgraded that from Luke Cunnin to Nito Niederreiter. I think that is a big upgrade, and I think that adds some significant depth scoring. And you add Ryan McDonagh on your blue line, who is a very, very good defensive defenseman. That's somebody that I think complements some of the more two-way guys on your roster a little bit more. Ideally would be a fantastic partner for somebody like Alexander Carrier. Let Carrier kind of be more of like a play driver, like a mini Yossi a little bit while McDonagh stays back. I think that was, another element that I think a lot of people kind of overlooked for the Predators roster last year was they needed some blue line depth. So it's interesting to see what the Nashville Predators need to do. I would imagine the big next step is going to be Yakov Trenin. Obviously, now the David Poile has filled the hole in the top six. Obviously, he's got Philip Forsberg locked up. He got the Ryan McDonagh deal done. I think now his attention turns to Yakov Trenin. And depending on what happens with that situation, maybe that determines either right before training camp or maybe later in the summer. Maybe that's when Poile takes another look at the roster and says, is there like one or two more things that need to be tweaked here? And maybe we see another big trade. Like maybe something happens. So patience, everybody. We said it last week. This is a situation that's going to require a lot of patience. Hey, so what might the forward core look like if this is it? Like if this is the deal that David Poile's rolling to the table with, what is that offensive lines going to look like? What are the line combinations? Let's talk about that in just a second. But first, want to make sure that everybody is following Locked On NHL. The Locked On experts give you a daily 30-minute podcast on all things NHL all year long. Stay up to date on everything in the hockey world. Locked On NHL, your daily 30-minute NHL podcast. So line combinations. It's still a big topic of conversation. Obviously, there's maybe some obvious ones out there. Obviously we know that the first line and the third line are probably going to stay together, but there may be some interesting things you can do elsewhere. So let's kind of look at what we think the Nashville Predators line combinations could be next year after some of the moves they made this offseason. First line, you have Philip Forsberg, Mikael Granlund, Matt Duchene. That was kind of the number one line you rolled out with for most of last season. I say that stays together. Really do. You can maybe move Johansson or Granlund, kind of flip-flop them if you want, but I say Mikael Granlund had the best chemistry with Forsberg and Duchesne on the wings. And he is a very underrated, I think, top-end center, which is weird because he was a wing to start his Nashville Predators tenure. Granlund, I think, is the best option for center for that line. Very sneaky two-way player. He's a great 200-foot guy. Pretty underrated on faceoffs, a good facilitator of plays, and very smart. And I think that's somebody you need for your top line also, is somebody who is smart, because you're going against the other team's fastest guys, their best guys. You're going to need somebody with some good hockey IQ to kind of try to outsmart them and read the plays. So I think Granlund gives that best option on the second line. Now, Johansson on the second line. Obviously, we think Nino Niederreiter, the new addition for the Preds, is going to be there. The two have some chemistry in the past. They both played on the Portland Winterhawks. They're both on the same line there. But who's the other second line winger? That I would like to see Phil Thomasino. No, I know it's kind of between him and Tolvanen at this point. A lot of people also thought maybe Tanner Genoa out there, but I think that herd line should probably stick together. I think Phil Tomasino is ready for that next step. I mean, we saw it last year, especially kind of towards the end, where whenever he was on the ice, he made something happen. Whether it was a big play, a hustle play, or just, kind of creating space for himself. His offensive instincts are there. And I think the only knock on him was that maybe the rest of his game hadn't developed, still didn't have that defensive instinct that maybe you want from somebody in your top six. But I think this is a perfect a perfect opportunity for him to kind of rise up and take that next step, because you have Nino Niederreiter on the other wing, who is also a very good 200-foot player. Ryan Johansson, very underrated defensively. That's a line you can roll up there and know you're going to have some offense. And I think Tomasino, not only does he blend in well with that line, but I think he's done enough. And if he takes that other step this offseason, it's going to really show. I think he's a guy that you look at and say he can create plays for that line. Like if Niederreiter is like the dirty goal finisher and, Johansson's kind of the setup man, like the physical setup man, Tomasino can be the guy that makes kind of the nifty play, like the finesse play. He's somebody that I think can use his skating to open up space for the other two guys. And then when he does, and he opens up space in that middle of the ice, you have two pretty physical guys who are capable of scoring. So I think Tomasino is going to be a pretty nifty addition to that second line if that's what they go with. Obviously, the third line, I think you stick with the herd line. No need to break that up, especially if Yakov Trenin is back. Colton Sissons is definitely one of the most underrated guys on the team. A Swiss Army knife, can do it all. I mean, he can, add a little bit of a scoring pop when needed. Yakov Trenin, I think, was, 17 goals last year. I think maybe he's ready to take that next step, even if he's just like a 20 goal, 15 assist scorer, somebody who scores a decent number of goals, but maybe not high in points. I think that's fine. That's exactly what you need from your third line. It's somebody like Yakov Trenin who can score, maybe not like all the time, but enough that it's like, okay, we're getting some depth scoring there. And then Jeannot's going to be interesting. Was last year a fluke? Was it just, the fact that people were kind of letting him? Or is he really a diamond in the rough for the Predators? Of course, he had that big start to last season. A lot of people kind of put him in the conversation for Calder. There's still some Preds fans that think he should still be in that conversation. And then he kind of, got a little bit quiet down the stretch. So it kind of makes you wonder, hey, is the start of his last season for real? Or is he just kind of going to go back to maybe being just, a grindy depth guy? This is going to be big for him, but I would love to see Tanner Jeannot and Yakov Trenin stay on that herd line, give the Preds some energy, shift momentum. That's the kind of thing you want from your third line. Fourth line. This is going to be interesting because there's a couple of different directions the Preds can go. At center, I really want to see Cody Glass. Like, I would love to see Cody Glass go to Nashville, stay in Nashville, and have this be the year that he kind of rises to the occasion. It's interesting because last year, the Preds penciled him in kind of as like their number 2 center, and then that's sort of or number 2, number 3 center, and that kind of fell apart as the year went on, which was interesting. But he's back playing in a different role towards the end of last year, and now you kind of see his game and think, okay, this is somebody I think could benefit playing on the third line. Or I'm sorry, the fourth line, because you're giving him an opportunity to play to kind of show that he's not that he's improved defensively and as a 200-foot player, and you have him in a spot where he can still contribute like a little bit of a scoring touch. The thing with your fourth line is you don't play him a whole lot. I'm sure if this is where Glass is next year, maybe 14 minutes a game tops. But when you're out there, you want to notice them. Like you want to notice them make an impact. And I think that's a perfect spot for Cody Glass. Also, I think it's a perfect spot for Ellie Tolvanen because, for all of his scoring woes last year, I still think he did a lot of things really well. He played defense really well, underratedly, one of Nashville's best defensive forwards, which is saying a lot last year. He plays a very good game. And I think, if you take him out of a spot where he's expected to score goals, maybe you take the pressure off of him and maybe you can maximize the kind of shifts he gives you. So I think putting Tolvanen maybe on the fourth line with Cody Glass, that is an offense, that's kind of the same situation. You're not putting them out there for a long period of time, but when you're out there, you expect them to do some good things. I think that can be a very underrated pairing, Glass and Tolvanen. And on the other side, I would assume it's Zach Sanford, the new addition to the Predators lineup. Fine. I mean, he's basically a Nick Cousins replacement. Did very, very well as kind of a two-way guy in St. Louis. Kind of had a bad year last year, but he bounced around between first Ottawa and then Winnipeg. So you can't really, I guess, put too much stock into that. But it's going to be interesting. Obviously Michael McCarron is still out there as well. You also have Kiefer Sherwood, who signed a one-way contract. So you'd have to mention he's probably in the mix somewhere, either as like an extra forward or what have you. So there's definitely going to be some forward shuffling options. But I think those are the four lines the Nashville Predators should roll with. Let me know what you think. Like if you think you would like to see a different line combination, let me know. Tweet the show at LO_Predators or leave a comment on YouTube. Interesting to hear your thoughts. Coming up on the Locked On Predators podcast this week, couple of good shows planned. Jared Ellis from Locked On Hurricanes, he's going to be joining us later this week to talk about what Preds fans can expect from Nino Niederreiter. We talked about him a little bit, but he is a guy who has watched Niederreiter the last handful of seasons, knows what he's capable of, knows who he might fit in well with for the Nashville Predators. So he's going to give us some insight on that. And then later this week, it's free agency across the NHL. So let's take a walk down memory lane, shall we? We're going to be looking at the best and worst free agent deals in the history of the Nashville Predators. That is going to be a fun show. I've done some articles like this for On the Forecheck, but haven't done this in podcast form yet. So you are going to want to tune in for that. In the meantime, you can find me on Twitter at _NSMorgan. As I mentioned, you can read my work at On the Forecheck as well. If you are watching this on YouTube, be sure to like the video, subscribe, leave a comment. That helps us get this content out to more Preds fans like yourself. And as always, you can find us on any audio podcasting platform, Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, anything like that. If you have a go-to audio platform for your podcast, we're probably on there. So be sure you subscribe there as well so you know when we put out new shows. That's going to do it for us today on the Locked On Predators podcast. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We'll be back tomorrow with more.